Waldy and Bendy.
Hello and welcome to Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art, the podcast they could not stop. I'm Waldemar Januszczak, art critic of the Sunday Times here in London, and I'm joined on this runaway train of a podcast by a man who goes where he wants, when he wants. He's a free spirit, a free thinker, and maybe, just maybe, a Freemason. Bendy, are you really a member of the Wobbly Finger Brigade? I mean, I know you never tell these things honestly, but are you or aren't you?
Yeah, well, I'm the Deputy Grand Vizier, or whatever they are, of the art world Freemasons, and we mustn't tell anyone, but you're the Great Mason. You are the chief toad who sits upon the art world, controlling everything, but don't tell anyone our secret.
Chief Toad, well, that's below the belt, Bendy. Now, the reason I ask is because I came across something about you the other day. It sort of popped up on my internet feed, and it said that you're actually descended from Charles II. I mean, is that true?
Yeah, but like most of us, well, because it's only because he had so many illegitimate children that pretty much half the population is. And by virtue
No, that's not. Come on. Don't lead us astray with phony statistics. You're descended from Charles II, and that's the Stuart line, isn't it? So that's the Jacobites, isn't it, who tried to reinstall the Scottish James II to the throne, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm the wrong side of the blanket, poverty excluded, poor benighted side of the family. Same with my Grosvenor genealogy. Everyone thinks I must be completely loaded because I'm connected to the Grosvenor family, but I'm from the very poor side of the family world.
But that's why I suggested the Freemason thing, because one of the things they say about the Freemasons is that it started with you Jacobites trying to engineer the fall of the English monarchy. That's what they say, don't they?
Yeah, we're still trying, Weld.
Yeah. Well, all I want to say is I'm on your side on this. I'm not a Freemason, but I'm always with you, Bendy. You know that. Now, last week on the podcast, I tried to surprise you with an animal whose name is an anagram of art, right? And I know you don't like these animals, but I was only trying to help you with your phobia by showing you sort of positive images of this creature.
Nice by showing you
No, there were positive images of this creature whose name is an anagram of art, and they were by the great Hokusai, right? And since then, Bendy, I've been inundated with letters of complaint about my behaviour.
All from my mum.
From distressed members of the Bendy Grosvenor fan club. Mostly, I have to say, distressed damsels, calling me a bully, saying they're not going to listen to the podcast anymore. Bendy, will you please tell your adoring fans that I was trying to be nice and that they should lay off me?
Well, I can't help it. Well, I set my AI army of bots off on you.
Well, I wish they'd stop, because it's got me frightened. I'm scared I'm going to walk out the door and I'm going to be hit on the head by a Bendy Grosvenor fan. Anyway, look, on a more positive note, it's a busy show today, Bendy, so we're going to be plunging into the fabulous world of Gothic cathedrals. I can't wait for that. I love Gothic cathedrals. Also, an exciting and mysterious Indian artist, Amrita Sher-Gil. And that's for our small but precious Indian audience, because I noticed the other day we've got a few new listeners from India, which is all very exciting. So that's going to be great. But first, as always in art, there's another side of the coin, because art is damnably varied. It's shocking news from the art world. So Bendy woken up today and found that basically the whole art world seems to be on strike. At least here in London at the Tate Modern, Tate Britain. The workers went on strike last week and put up lots of barricades outside the museum. You had to go through them, and I must say I didn't, because I support what they're doing basically. But almost more momentously, we've just heard that the Louvre staff, pretty much all the support staff, is going on strike from December the 15th. They're going to try and bring the entire museum to a halt. So what the hell's going on here, Bendy?
Low pay world is what's going on. I mean, anyone who's worked in the museum sector will know for a long time that pay is not great. In fact, I have a little statistic for you from the art newspaper, where 1 in 10 museum jobs, this is in the UK, is paid £9.50 an hour or less. So that's just about living wage or less, which is no good. And in fact, another stat for you, well, for curators, right, the median salary for an assistant curator is £20,000, which is £11,000 below the national median salary. So we've been storing up this problem for a long, long time, and the management classes, the bosses and the funders are running away from it. So we've got more and more strikes, is my opinion. What's yours?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, when you hear about directors' salaries, for example, the bosses at Tate, certainly, the people that I saw outside Tate Modern striking, they tell me that, the management bosses, they get six-figure pay salaries, they get bonuses every year. And there's one placard somebody put up saying that my annual salary is the equivalent of the boss's Christmas bonus. So there's obviously something very unfair going on there. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But it's not just about that, is it? It's about conditions of work. I mean, hopefully we'll go on to the Louvre as well, but just to stay with the Tate for a minute, you've got this enormous building, the Tate Modern in particular, which has actually expanded again when they built those things downstairs, the rooms specially for performance art and all that. The tanks, it's called. And you've got a sort of skeleton staff that has to run around trying to deal with the 3 or 4 million people a year that go in there. And the bigger it gets, all this sort of vanity museum architecture, the harder it is for people to run it. And of course, imagine what it costs to run and keep up a building like Tate Modern. I mean, every time they add another section to it, the zeros get added to the millions of pounds that it costs. I mean, these things just eat money. And when the money's spent on more vanity architecture and on directors' salaries indeed, no wonder the poor old staff get stuck at the other end, not knowing what to do. They've got to show people around, they've got to man the entrances, they've got to take the tickets, they've got to do all that, and they're being paid a pittance for it.
Yeah. Do you know, well, when I used to work in politics covering the museum brief, I developed a passion for a museum finance spreadsheet. Well, and so I've been going through some more of the numbers lately. And it's really interesting what you say, because not only are places like Tate expanding physically in terms of their estate, but they're expanding managerially. And it's absolutely clear, if you look at the numbers for Tate, that the kind of the management class has not only do they pay themselves more in real terms than they did about 20 years ago, in contrast to kind of median lower wage pay, but it's also expanded. It's got bigger. So you've got lots and lots more bosses. And it seems to me that the place is becoming more of a kind of corporate structure. And when you, I think you can say the same about the Louvre, because when these places open up satellite museums or go international, like Louvre, Abu Dhabi, and Tate, of course, expanded from Tate Britain to Tate Modern. So they felt that they not only needed to have a director of Tate Modern, but to have a kind of super director on top, a director of the two directors. And underneath them, they all have deputy directors and managing directors and so on. So this, I think, is part of the story.
Interrupting quickly, Bendy, that's not just two directors on two directors, because you've also got Tate Liverpool, you've got Tate St Ives, they've all got directors. So it's a bit like a McDonald's franchise. You open a new branch of the Tate in another city, that's going to need a new director, and a new director sitting on the super director. So that's been going on as well, hasn't it? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, but I think obviously all these individual places should have their own directors. But what happens is the trend, and this is international too. The trend is that the people at the top, who of course control the money and the resources and pay themselves more and look after their jobs first, you get these very top-heavy organisations. We've seen the same in the National Gallery of Scotland up here, where they kind of merged in Edinburgh the Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery, the Modern Art Gallery into a superstructure called the National Galleries of Scotland, who has, they have, up here we have a Director General, not just a director, but a Director General. It's like some sort of, a bad guy from Star Wars. So that's happening. And at the same time, Wild, here's the really odd thing. Visitor numbers for Tate have been declining. And that's in contrast, particularly to other London museums who've recovered quite well after the pandemic. But visitors at Tate are going down. So organisation getting bigger, salaries at the top getting bigger, but not at the bottom, and visitor numbers getting smaller. And I think that's a whole bigger issue that we've really got to address as well as low pay.
Well, let's address that in a minute, but can we just switch to the Louvre for a second? So get out of London and go to the Louvre. Because one thing you can't say about the Louvre is that visitor numbers have gone down. The Louvre is the most popular museum in the world. I mean, they get up to 10 million visitors a year, right? And each visitor pays, I mean, it's sort of, what is it, a standard fee is what, 22 euros. And from next year, by the way, if you're outside the EU, non-EU citizens are going to be paying 32 euros to go in the Louvre. Now, you multiply 22 euros by 10 million, and you get an awful lot of money. What is it? Well, 220 million euros a year income, plus whatever they make from the merch, which is horrendously expensive there. So there's a lot of money pouring into the Louvre. Why are the people complaining? Well, they're complaining because that money basically is not going to them, not in any meaningful way. So we know Macron recently announced that he's going to build a great big new entrance for the Louvre, and it's going to cost 800 million euros, and the Louvre is going to be even better, and 13 million people a year are going to go in there. Bendy, you and I, if we've ever been to the Louvre, do we want another 13 million people a year going in there? No, we don't. It's already horrendous trying to get round there, trying to get into it, trying to enjoy it. The last thing the Louvre needs to do is expand even more. But these kind of vanity museum projects, and I think this is what's going on at the Tate as well, there's a sort of vanity at work where people think that their museums have to keep changing, growing, building bigger things, having new doorways. And it's, I suppose, essentially to do with the fact that art has become this kind of big player on the tourist front, hasn't it? I mean, it is a big attraction to cities. People go to Paris to see the Louvre, they come to London to see Tate Modern. And there's a sense as well in which art, and I think this is its sort of superpower when it comes to museums, art can turn nowhere into somewhere. I mean, there are plenty of museums in the land now that were basically built in a field in the middle of nowhere, but people will travel there because there's something on show they haven't seen. I don't know, something like the Iron Bridge Museum, or the classic example is Bilbao in Spain, part of the Guggenheim, designed by Frank Gehry, beautiful modernist building. No one ever used to go to Bilbao, now they pour in. So museums can turn nowhere into somewhere, and if you're a museum director, you get your name written on lights somewhere or other, and you feel like a big hero because you've enlarged this blooming place even more. So there is this sort of huge vanity involved in growing, and the staff haven't been able to keep up with it. That's right, isn't it?
Well, I like a museum that grows and gets more people in. I find it odd that so often the first solution they reach for when something might be going wrong, wherever it is in the museum, is a new front door. So it's like, okay, we need another bigger front door now. Let's spend 20, 30 million pounds on that.
Yeah. What's wrong with a small front door? That's what I say, But it is vanity. I'll tell you, it's directorial vanity to a large extent. But let's not get back to the Tate. Okay, you were going to tell me why visitor numbers at the Tate are down and why they're not a match for post-pandemic numbers from other museums, which have basically recovered since COVID kind of reasonably well. Why hasn't the Tate?
Well, I'd love to get your views. I mean, I think we all have our opinions. But above all, I went round recently, and I have to say, we discussed last week Turner and Constable, a new show at Tate Britain. That is clearly, I suspect, going to buck the trend. And I'm told, actually, by my spies within Tate, that the curators are now charged with setting certain exhibitions in terms of footfall. So they say, right, this slot in the exhibition calendar, you have to get however many 100,000, tens of thousands of people through the door. And that is the sort of template for the exhibitions going forward. So the good news is that someone at Tate thinks we've got to reverse this decline in visitor numbers. But I don't know when you last went through the rooms upstairs. Ever since they had the Grand Rehang, which was unveiled a few years ago at Tate Britain, I feel, and I felt the other day when I went round, the labels are getting slightly more patronising and damning. And I think part of the problem, particularly why Tate Britain visitors number goes down, is that they don't like the product they're selling. And no shop or business will get customers through the door if they tell you their own product is crap. So you get these endless labels saying, here's a painting, but the person who's in it, and this is true, this is the label I saw the other day on a portrait by John Riley. Here's a portrait by John Riley, but the person who's in it married someone whose grandfather was involved in the slave trade in the 18th century, in the 17th century. So it's just like you go around and there's this constant sort of parade of British art is kind of bad. And sort of morally wrong. And I think that's going to put people off, isn't it? What do you think?
Yeah, I think this has been a problem at Tate Britain since the start, frankly. When the Tate split asunder, in the year 2000, we had a Tate Modern built that was going to be full of contemporary new stuff, things that you hate, contemporary art with a buzz to it. And Tate Britain was going to be the home of British art, art that came from here, that is summed up in your book, the invention of British art, why British art is different, what's in it. So actually, I think a splendid ambition for a museum. Why not? Let's find out what British art has got to offer. But since then, we've had a succession of directors there who feel as if, basically, they don't really like British art. They're embarrassed by it. And they're certainly not interested in it on any historic level. I mean, the way that Tate Britain keeps trying to shove contemporary art into itself, ever since the Turner Prize, any chance they get to put something contemporary on, rather than look properly at Lely or William Dobson or any of the older art in there, their Tudor collection, their Elizabethan collection, and particularly their Victorian collection, which is actually, of course, the most popular part of it, incidentally, they try and avoid it. And there is this sort of shame. It's this cultural cringe they have about having a museum devoted to British art. Now, I really resent that. I mean, I don't see why British art shouldn't be as proud of its good achievements as anywhere else. And these labels that you talk about, I mean, they've got to a kind of silliness, haven't they? I mean, of course, some of our museums have reason to feel guilty about their funding. None of them have a history that is absolutely spotless. But we know that, don't we, now? And to keep going on and on and on and on about it in the labels, you just feel it's more about the curator's sense of inadequacy and guilt than it is about what people actually want to see. So I don't know about you. I do not go to museums to be lectured or talked down to or patronised. I go to museums to be excited, to see fabulous things, to feel that art has something to offer that nothing else does. And this is a problem across the whole of museum land at the moment, which seems to have been taken over by, I hate the word woke because it's so disparaging about some things that are very important. It's very important to right some wrongs in art, to have more women artists, to offer a shop window for black art, etc., etc. All that is really important, and it's happening, and it's a great thing. But my goodness, can we not just occasionally move off from that onto another subject and just see things in a different way? Stop lecturing people. Museums are not there to make you a better person, Bendy, or me a better person. Although in my case, that'd be a lot easier than it will in yours.
Well, I'm actually quite woke, I have to say. And I'm also really in favour of this term in history, rebalancing the canon, as you say, getting more representatives, more women artists in. And in fact, I can tell you that in the Tate Gallery at the moment, in Tate Britain at the moment, there is a portrait by an artist called Anne Killigrew, who is one of very few female artists that work in Stuart 17th century Britain. And it's my picture. It belongs to my wife and I. It's one of my little discoveries, and we've lent it to them. And I'm so pleased to see it there. And in fact, it's in a room where, for the first time in the story of British art, you get almost equal representation from female artists. Now, I was there when I was there the other day, literally right next to my painting. And I'm not trying to tell the curators or the labour writers what to say, but it's just interesting. Next to my painting, there's a bit of wall text about the Royal African Company and its role in slave trade in the 17th century, which is totally unconnected to any of the paintings on that wall. It's just like you're going along, oh, there's a nice painting, and oh, I've got to read this bit now about slavery. So I'm all in favour of putting these elements back into the story, but it's got to be connected in some way to the stuff you're looking at in a meaningful sense, don't you think?
I totally agree.
Let's just. So now you've started me on this. I'm just going to make one.
I'll do my bit in a second. Go on. What else are you moaning about?
It's one really important. The story of British art, the way the Tate Britain tells it at the moment, it's like a kind of national portrait gallery with political steroids. It's deliberately framed, as it says on the first label when you go in a way that resonates with us today. So it's not about telling the story of the art as it was at the time. And Tate's whole story is a construct based on portraiture. So you go into the first room and it's Tudor portraits. There's no religious art, there's no kind of folk art, there's literally nothing at all other than the story they want to tell you in such a way as to frame it negatively. And I'm not surprised that the numbers are going down because first of all, it's historically inaccurate, and it's just off-putting. It's dull, it's boring, and it's repetitive. And I'm going to have to stop myself.
No,
Well,
it's
you
like I
stop
said.
me.
I mean, you and I, or anybody, none of our listeners from all around the world, and heaven knows we're getting fantastic numbers now from pretty much every state in America. The only state that I have that's only got one listener is Vermont. Everywhere else, has got many more. So we're doing well there. But every single person listening to this podcast, none of them go to museums to be improved as human beings. And yet, can I draw a parallel here with what happened in France in the 19th century? So, you know the Paris Salon. So the Paris Salon was this great establishment that basically controlled art in 19th century France. It put on the most important exhibition in France, which was this salon show that happened every year. And it decided who went and won the Prix de Rome, who should be in the School of Beaux-Arts. It was the establishment, controlled everything. And the art that it supported and pushed out at people was deeply moralistic. This art, which they called the art pompier, named after the French word for a fireman's helmet, because it involved basically having lots of Greek and Roman soldiers wandering around being morally superb. So, it was the art that taught the populace a kind of moral lesson. If you're at Thermopylae, you stand on the bridge and you fight till your death, because that's the heroic thing to do. And so, etc., this kind of extraordinary panoply of classical and post-classical moments celebrated again and again and again in these huge moralistic pictures. So what happens to the Salon? It's the most successful establishment in France in the 19th century. The exhibition is the most successful exhibition in the world at that time. What happens to it? A bunch of chaps called the Impressionists and a couple of women called the Impressionists come along. They put on a show above a photographer's gallery in the middle of Paris, and they change art. The Impressionists changed art and the direction of art. They overthrew the Salon because what they offered was an art that spoke to everybody from the heart rather than a moralising art that turns you into a better person. And what's happened in our museums, particularly the Tate, is that the people that have taken over these museums, they think we're a bunch of lugheads who need to be improved. And at every level, we need a new history, we need a new morality, we need to be better people. And that's just not what people want from museums. So they're not going. They're not going to Tate Modern because nobody wants to go to a museum to have someone wag their finger at them and call them guilty.
I've got the solution, Weld. We must move on to happier topics, but I have got the solution. You are going to be the director of Tate Modern, and I am going to be the director of Tate Britain, and we will abolish the post of director of directors, capo di capos, and spend that money raising the salaries of everyone else, okay? I hope that's what our single listener in Vermont can get behind.
Yeah, the single listener in Vermont. Yeah, please do write in and tell us if you think that's a good idea or not. But you had a better move on because I'm going to blow my top soon, and I love nothing better than a museum, so I want to keep my access to them free, and I want to keep them accessible. Listen, Bendy, did you know that exactly 112 years ago, yes, 112 years ago, somebody special was born in a special part of the world?
Dodgy, dodgy, dodgy anniversary.
Bendy, the Dodgy anniversary is the birthday of an exceptional artist from India who's called Amrita Sher-Gil. Now, I don't know if you have heard of her even or know much about her, but in my case, I came across her in a big way, really, a couple of years ago, and when I was making a series about various uncivilized topics in art that took me to India, and I went to the National Museum of Modern Art in Delhi and came across Amrita Sher-Gil, and frankly, she knocked me out. I thought she was such an interesting and fascinating presence and such a good artist. So she was born in 1913, died in 1941, so a short life. And in that time, she managed to pack in so much stuff. She was actually born in Hungary. Her father was Indian, but her mother was Hungarian. So she was born in Hungary, but then went back to India as soon as she could. And then when she was 16, the family decided she was so talented at art that they would send her to Paris to have some tuition. So they all moved to Paris to support her, the 16-year-old girl and her family. And she joined various French schools, including the École des Beaux-Arts, which is, the most prestigious art school in Paris. And she did so well that when she was 19, she painted this picture called Young Girls, which went into the Paris Salon, the aforementioned Paris Salon I've just been complaining about, and it won the gold medal. She was 19, yeah. So this painting, have you seen it, Young Girls, Bendy? Have you come across it at all?
I have indeed, only because you put me onto it, but yes, I have. Very nice thing.
Okay, so it shows two women in a French living room. One is Indian, so dark-skinned. The other's very blonde. And in fact, one of them is Amrita Sher-Gil's sister, Indira, and the other was a French friend of hers. And what's interesting, apart from the sheer bravura and confidence with which it's painted, for a 19-year-old, it's an exceptional piece of paintwork, is that it kind of swaps the roles of the two girls in the picture. So the darker girl, the Indian girl, Indira, she's dressed like a fashionable Parisian girl of the 1930s. It was actually painted in 1929, right? So it's right in the middle of the Art Deco era. So she's fashionable, she looks like a street star, absolutely elegant, typical Parisian dress. But the other girl, who's the Parisian girl, she's sitting down wearing a rather sort of sloppy robe, and a bit of her nudity is sticking out, quite provocatively. She's got blonde hair, and she looks a little bit as if she ought to be swapping roles, really, with the Indian girl. Now, I say that because up until this point certainly in Western art history, most artists of the Indian subcontinent and India were basically seen to be rather exotic, and the art that was made about India was exotic, and it tended to show people as these kind of lovable foreigners far out in the east, looking glorious and beautiful. And what Amrita Sher-Gil has done here is kind of reverse the roles. So the exotic figure here, the Tahitian nude almost, is the French girl, whereas the Indian girl is looking more respectable. So I think there's a really interesting bit of identity politics going on here. There's a swapping of the roles, quite deliberately by Amrita Sher-Gil, to highlight the way that people were basically viewing these two different cultures. So it had this kind of deeper meaning. And, imagine this is Paris in 1929. So, Picasso's there, Braque's there, Surrealism's happening. It's a fantastically busy time in Paris and a great time to have been there. But she decides to go back to India, and in India, slowly but wonderfully, she starts to construct this fantastic career for herself as the great modern painter of modern India. And she starts to paint village people, she starts to paint outside Delhi, she paints mothers and children, and they have this almost a religious air to them, these great paintings, which are all on show at the Museum of Modern Art in Delhi. And they have an almost religious air and also a kind of sadness to them, because the poverty was real. Times were hard, life was hard for people who weren't of the highest caste in India. And so it's just a fantastic body of work. And I know she's got a big show coming up this year, which is going to be touring Europe, Amrita Sher-Gil. And really, this is just a way of saying to anybody out there who's listening, go and see it. This is a fantastic artist. The expansion of our idea of what makes good art is going on at the moment, and Amrita Sher-Gil certainly fits that bill. I don't know if you had any comments to make about that, Bendy, because I know you've sort of got involved in her work a bit since I told you to, haven't you?
I'm just fascinated by that moment in Indian art, and I wonder if it's too strong or silly a word to attach to it, a renaissance. Because that moment when Indian art and Indian artists like Amrita are finding their voice again, and it's coinciding with the kind of growth of Indian nationalism, obviously, against British rule in the 1920s and 30s. I don't know enough about that period artistically, but I just find it interesting to see how it develops, in contrast to the bit I know a little bit more about, which is when the British take control of India in the 18th century, their role artistically is almost entirely destructive. They come along and they view, because they are the superior civilization taking colonial control of things, they view the kind of art they find, particularly Mughal art, as crude, sort of almost barbaric. People like Ruskin are very, very sniffy about this. And the bits that they do like, so they find things like the Taj Mahal and they go, oh, well, that's quite good. We can't really be too sniffy about that. They try and sort of pin this on earlier, entirely confected sort of white Aryan influence on Indian society and Indian art. So what happens is you get this kind of a complete squashing, complete erasure of I hate the word, but I'm going to use it, of native Indian art, right? And so what the British Raj, they import their own artists. So even our great hero, Johann Zoffany, goes out to India and he paints the Rajas and the princes. And you get this kind of transformation, this destruction of Indian art and this transformation to what they said everybody should be painting superior, Western, classical and what they call the academic style. So that takes hold, right? But it's in that moment in the 20s and 30s when people begin to challenge that. And Amrita, I think, is at that moment. I think the tragedy, of course, Weld, is that she dies so young and we don't quite know how that story, through her eyes, would have continued.
Indeed. It's a great quote by her. She says, when people asked her why she was painting these village folk and in these lovely, gentle, melancholy pictures, and she said, "Europe belongs to Picasso, India only to me." And it was such a powerful ambition. Unfortunately, I think she probably needed to go to Paris and to be filled a little bit with the confidence of the Parisian school and to have come into contact with all these arrogant French blokes saying how great they are in Paris at the time. For her to at least be given an opportunity to express her own brilliance, when she returned to India. But I'm so interested by what you say about older Indian art, because frankly, having been there on many occasions now, there is almost nowhere in the world I'd rather go to see great art. India is an absolute treasure trove of brilliant achievements. It's not just the Mughal palaces, although they are stunning. But if you look at Indian miniatures of the 16th, 17th century, they're so glorious. These fantastic temple complexes, like Khajuraho in northern India, they are full of the most exceptional sculpture and stuff which really thrills you and excites you. There's a vibe to Indian art that is so intense. And I absolutely love it, and I will go on at every opportunity. So I guess what I'm really grateful for is that having always gone to India before to see the great art of the past, be it the Taj Mahal or the Red Fort in Delhi, these fabulous mosques and Indian temples, I can now go and find things to look at in the world of modern Indian art. And that's a great pleasure for me. So my advice is to all our international listeners, and especially as well the ones who are in India, if you haven't actually gone and had a look at the work of Amrita Sher-Gil in Delhi, please do, because it's exceptional. And as for everybody else, of course go there. There's so much great art to be seen in India. And Bender, I'm sure you've loved it every time you've been there, right?
Only once, but can't wait to go back again, Weld. Yeah.
Hopefully we can go together. We can hitchhike around India and see all the great art, including Amrita Sher-Gil.
The one time I did go to India, I did that very studenty thing, is I went round with a motorbike. But because I'd never ridden a motorbike before, I got one with a sidecar attached to it. So we could do that.
Me in the sidecar and you driving?
Yeah.
You've got to be kidding. Was it one of the... There's a bike, isn't there, called the Indian. And I know it's collected by motorcycle buffs.
Royal Enfield.
The Royal Enfield Indian. It's a beautiful bike. I mean, I'd do it, except you have been on the roads in India, haven't you? It's taking your life in your hands, going around there. I'm not sure I've got enough faith in you as a driver.
That was part of the fun, particularly when the sidecar decided to detach itself from my motorbike, and off I went. Solo.
So that's why you want to put me in it. You're trying to get me back for those creatures whose name is an anagram of art. That's what's happening, isn't it? Bendy, let's move on. Let's hope everybody goes to India because it's wonderful. Let's hope they look at Amrita Sher-Gil. But we've got to move on because we are going back to Europe, I think, and not only that, but to one of the really, really great eras of art in Europe, and it's an early one.
Tales of the Art World.
So, Bendy, Tales of the Art World, we are going to go back in time, me and you, and we're going to look at a really splendid epoch in European art and architecture, which rejoices by that moody and wonderful name of the Gothic era. So it's a great time, isn't it, Bendy?
Oh, it's one of my favourites, and I think it's also quite often misunderstood. So I'm really looking forward to going through it and hearing some of your favourite examples. We're going to focus, I think, mainly on Gothic church architecture, aren't we? At that crucial period in the medieval period when it gets going and transforms the way we build our religious buildings, not only in Europe but across the world.
Absolutely. Just an aside. So I actually went to a concert last night. My daughter was playing in an orchestra in a church called St. Gabriel's here in Pimlico, and it was a neo-Gothic church, so one of those ones that was built in the 19th century to look like an early Gothic church. So all the details were complete, but it was a fabulous experience. It was a Christmas carol concert, this wonderful interior. Okay, it was a bit fake, but it didn't feel it at the time. There's nothing quite like Gothic architecture to frame a spiritual, even a religious experience. So as locations, as places, boy, are they marvellous.
Yeah, and I think if I could start the story, I think it helps explain just that feeling you get. And I think this is really interesting to understand. Can I start the story with the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the Basilica of Saint-Denis, which is outside Paris? Have you been there?
Yes, I have. I mean, it's always said to be like the first Gothic building, isn't it? Or the first Gothic church.
Yeah, it's regarded as the first complete Gothic church in Europe. And the key figure in the transformation here is an abbot called Abbot Sher-Gil, and I'm sorry for butchering his pronunciation for French listeners. But he was abbot from around about the early 1100s, right, onwards. And when he got to the Basilica then of Saint-Denis, it was pretty much, I think we would call it architecturally sort of early Romanesque. Okay, so it was a Carolingian basilica built from about the 8th century onwards. And if people want to imagine what that looked like, it was just imagine old St. Peter's in Rome, this kind of Roman temple which had been Christianized, so a big central rectangular block with columns and then sort of smaller aisles either side of that. So Abbot Sher-Gil, he gets to this abbey and he decides he's going to rebuild it. And he wants to rebuild it for a very specific purpose. And this, Wald, is the key transformational moment in how we get Gothic architecture in Europe. Abbot Sher-Gil was a believer in a Christian theologian called Dionysius. Have you heard of him?
Heard about him, know nothing about him. Nothing at all.
Okay. Now, Dionysius, he believed that God was manifest in a kind of suprasensual light, that there wasn't sort of, a bearded old fellow up in the heavens, but God was everywhere around us, and we experienced him in the form of light. It was a kind of divine light, okay? What he called the Pater Luminum, holy light, light of the fathers. Now, Abbot Sher-Gil really bought into this thesis, and he particularly felt that he experienced this idea that by seeing God's light reflect off objects, off people, off beautiful things, that somehow you could sort of absorb basically God. You could sort of experience that kind of divine sense, and it lifted you from what Abbot Sher-Gil called the slime of the earth, and it took you up to heaven. He describes this feeling when he's looking at a beautiful altarpiece. He describes seeing the holy light and feeling sort of lifted subliminally up to the heavens. So Abbot Sher-Gil, okay, just imagine, he's come to this abbey. It's quite old-fashioned architecturally, and he wants more light into it, well. So to get more light into it, he decides to rebuild the church, and he embraces this engineering revolution at the time, which was just beginning to emerge into Europe, well, of, do you know what, the pointed arch. And as an engineering buff, I'm sure you could tell listeners why a pointed arch was better than a round arch.
Absolutely.
If you wanted more light in your church.
Absolutely, because I know about Romanesque architecture, which was the preceding style, if you like. The Romanesque architecture, as the name suggests, was from the Romans. It basically consisted of having really thick walls with very few openings in them, because they had to support a very heavy roof, which was rounded. So all the pressure in that roof basically came down to the walls at a difficult angle, pushed them sideways, so those walls had to be exceptionally thick. And so Romanesque churches, they're basically dark, they're sort of lumpy, and they've got big stone walls, and you never feel uplifted in the way you've just said when you walk into them, at least not obviously so. But what they did with Gothic arches was that they were able to make the walls much thinner, because the arch was constructed on a different system, so the pressure went straight down, and so the arch could meet at the top like that, and it meant that the walls here didn't have to be so thick, and that you could have ribbed vaulting, which went sort of that way, and bore the weight on a few struts going across, rather than this massive, great Romanesque tunnel of stone, which you used to have. So basically it means the architecture could get lighter. That's right, isn't it?
Yep, the architecture could get lighter, and you could have bigger windows, and you could get more light in. We should be clear here to say that Abbot Suger did not invent the Gothic arch, and in fact it had been around for a long time before in the Islamic world. And in fact, did you know that plucky old England, so if you go to Durham Cathedral, Wild, one of my favourites, which is mostly Norman Romanesque round arches, at the very top of it, when they finished building it, they started to introduce pointed arches. This is in around about the 1090s, okay? So it seems that the pointed arch actually came to England via the Normans, and the Normans, of course, had conquered Sicily, which before then had been an Islamic Arab island. Okay, so the pointed arch is floating around in Europe, and Abbot Suger, when he's abbot in the early 1100s in Saint-Denis, he fastens onto the pointed arch. And the reason we call Saint-Denis the first complete Gothic structure is that he didn't just have a pointed arch here or there, he decides to make the whole thing centre around the pointed arch. So you get these larger windows, thinner walls, as you say. Buttresses are crucial. And the great thing is, larger windows mean more stained glass, more holy light coming in to be painted, to be filtered and reflected down off more beautiful objects. And while I'll leave the story of Saint-Denis in this final moment, the reason it's so important is that for the first time, that sense you described of Gothic architecture sort of letting us feel more spiritual and uploaded, it starts there. And it kind of, Suger says this emphatically, it sort of takes you halfway between the earth and the heavens. It's one of the reasons why the French and the Gothic architecture like such tall churches, okay? It's deliberately to get you up there. And if you visit Saint-Denis, which I hope people do, you will see Suger's motto. It's still carved over the door, and I'll end the story by reading it out. He says, as you go through the door, "The dull mind rises to truth through that which is material, and in seeing this light is resurrected from its former submersion." So this is where not only the story of Gothic architecture begins, but really I think it's a fundamental turning point in the story of religious art, because it means you have beautiful things which light reflects off, jewels, paintings, statues, and it all starts here, and Gothic is really important.
Fabulous. Yes, everybody go and see the Great Basilica at Saint-Denis. So I'm going to pick that story up, sort of. I mean, basically, every summer, Bendy, I go to France because we have a house in the south of France. We're privileged that way, not as privileged as you, but as privileged as we poor folk can get. So we drive down.
I have no house in France or any other country.
Yeah, but you're descended from Charles II, for heaven's sake. You outrank me in every single level. Listen, we drive through France, and always we stop off at towns that have great cathedrals, because there is no better holiday to be had, I think, than to stop off at, at Amiens, at Beauvais, at Reims, all these great cities that have wonderful cathedrals, and to indeed follow the story that you've started for us. Now, my favourite stop used to be the famous Chartres Cathedral, which, as you know, is thought of by pretty much everybody as the kind of embodiment of the great High Gothic style. So Chartres is always thought to be the perfect example. It certainly had, I think, the most glorious stained glass windows and an arrangement that was absolutely exemplary. Not only the way that the walls went and leaving a lot of room in the clerestory for the big windows, but also the way it was laid out, like a cross shape with a transept. So you go down the nave, then there's a transept going across, and then there's the chancel at the end with the choir and the main altar. So that sort of cross-shaped shape of the cathedral, all that was made manifest most perfectly, I think, at Chartres, right? But the trouble with Chartres is, in my opinion, they've ruined it. So a few years ago, they raised lots of money to repaint the entire interior. Now, as you know, there's been this move afoot for some time now, really, in restoration architecture, of trying to go back to what people say is the original. And Gothic cathedrals used to be highly coloured. They weren't sort of plain grey, which is what we love about them now. They tended to be quite gaudy. So somebody discovered that at Chartres there was various paint layers of pink paint which underlay the walls at the time, the whitewash walls, and they decided that if they returned all of this to the pink colour that lay underneath, they would make this cathedral more authentic, more original. Now, having been to Chartres lots of times when it was basically grey and dusty and full of soot, which had accrued over the hundreds of years, people lighting candles in there, what I realised was that the grey cathedral was the perfect setting for all that glorious stained glass. You know, the stained glass there with its blues, its reds, it just sat on these grey walls and buzzed and filled you with exactly this sensation you're talking about. This kind of Stendhal syndrome almost of knocking you out. It was absolutely brilliant. Then they painted it pink, and quite honestly, you go there now, you just don't feel it anymore to the same degree. I mean, it's like seeing somebody in the street wearing a toupee. You know that it's wrong. However good the toupee is, it just doesn't work. They've done that to Chartres, right? So I know there's a long way around of saying I no longer stop at Chartres on my way down to the south of France. Do you know where I stop?
You're going to tell me?
I stop at Bourges Cathedral.
Good choice.
Bourges, which
Good
I
choice.
absolutely adore. Now, the really interesting thing about Bourges Cathedral is that it's actually a variant on your typical Gothic. And that's what I like about it. So whereas most of these Gothic cathedrals that followed Abbot Suger's developments and the Gothic building style is that they went higher and higher and higher, and the windows got bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? That's basically what happened. More and more light came into the cathedral. But at Bourges, they had this revolutionary idea that what they would do is build the columns of the nave higher and higher and higher and higher, so the internal space was really high. And the top-level windows, therefore, in the clerestory were quite small, but it meant that they could have these gigantic windows by the side of the church, much lower down. So instead of having to stare way up and hurt your neck looking up at the stained glass at the top, you could just walk past it, almost at your level, and there it was at the side. And it was also a very wide cathedral. So whereas most cathedrals after Chartres were basically, 3 aisles, so the central nave and then 2 aisles on either side, Bourges had 5 aisles, which are all more or less the same height. So it's got its fantastic portico, by the way, 5 great doors, each of which has wonderful sculpture above them, which we're not going to go into here. But inside, you have this other kind of space. So it's lofty with all these gigantic columns going right up to the roof. And the space itself feels so magnificent. I mean, really uplifting. And then, to top it all, you start wandering around on the outside walls, and you can see the stained glass windows at your level. So you can really examine them, look carefully at what's going on in them. So it's a different type of Gothic, and it never caught on, actually. Most people went the other way with the gigantic windows higher up. But Bourges is the opposite of that, and I always find it a really stimulating place to stop. I love it.
Amazing. Is most of the medieval stained glass still in its place?
A lot of it is, absolutely, yes. Particularly around the altar, so down at the the high altar end, you can walk round and see this amazing ring of beautiful glass. And of course, the trouble with stained glass is that you really have to look at it carefully to find out what's going on in it. Because you and I, right? When you go and see some stained glass, it immediately impacts on you. There's such a wonderful feeling about stained glass. Literally coloured light coming through the windows. If it's a sunny day, it hits you and just transports you. But of course, it's all got messages. So if you look at it carefully, there's all stories going on there. The story of the Virgin Mary, the Passion of Christ. And really what you should do is give it proper consideration in terms of its themes and its subjects and really try and understand it. But that's difficult, isn't it? Because most of us, we just don't know the Bible well enough anymore, and we'd much rather just sit there and bask in the beauty of the lights.
Yeah, well, you're describing a fine example of that kind of Gothic impact on our souls even. And actually, Bourges, is one of more than 80 Gothic cathedrals that were built in France between about 1180 and 1230. There was this extraordinary explosion of Gothic architecture as it caught on. And in fact, we should say that the word Gothic is a very late invention that only emerges into our dictionary in about the 18th century. In fact, at the time, because it was a French thing, it was known around Europe as Opus Franciganum. Did you know that? It was called the French style, the French work. That's what Gothic was called.
So where did Gothic come from then?
Gothic, I think it starts out as, doesn't it, as a sort of literary description of sort of something vaguely scary, both beautiful and scary at the same time.
I wonder, because the Goths did rule Spain for quite a long time, back in the Dark Ages. They took over before the Islamic revolution in Spain, before the Muslims conquered Spain. The Goths were the presiding power in Spain, and they are indeed said in some sources to have been the inventors of the pointed arch. So certainly there were pointed arches made, or keystone arches as they were called then, in Gothic times in Dark Age Spain. I wondered if it was something to do with that. It's an interesting term, isn't it?
Yeah, it was coined really as an insult. So it comes about at the moment where they start to want
It's
to
the Hunchback of
Gothic
Notre
architecture.
Dame era, isn't it? You know, there's people swinging between the arches, monsters and things.
Well,
yes, Gothic
yeah,
as a disparaging term. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's when they're building all their churches in the classical style. So we'll probably come on to that at the end. So they're turning away from Gothic, and they use that word as an insult. But, well, I want to actually bring the story of Gothic architecture to England, if I may. Because I want our third choice. I will discuss just quite briefly. Probably my favourite English Gothic cathedral is Wells. Have you been to Wells Cathedral?
I have been to Wales, not for a while, I must say. It's been ages since I've been to Wales, but I remember it well. I remember it well. I almost remember it well. It's obviously a fabulous building.
So we're talking now about 1180s to around about 1240, and it's often described as the sort of perfect example, the most beautiful example of early English Gothic style. And one of the reasons it's so extraordinary is that it still has its original cloister, and people might know the Vicar's Close, which is that wonderful little street just beside the cathedral of little houses where the canons went. One of the reasons Wells is not only survived but was built so beautifully and richly at the time is it was what we call a community of secular canons. So it was kind of monastic, but the people who were in it and building it were canons. That is, they didn't take monastic vows. None of that poverty stuff, okay? They were all quite rich, if you like, privileged, okay? And that gets put into the building of Wells Cathedral, and that's why it's described as one of the most beautiful examples of early English Gothic. Let's just take people very quickly inside Wells. The reason I love Wells so much is that it's quite a distinctive version of Gothic architecture. The nave has the most beautiful proportions, I think. So I'm going to introduce three technical words here to describe Gothic architecture and the impact of the nave in Wells. On the lower level, the first level of pointed arch, we call those the arcade, right? And then above that, the level above that, you get a slightly smaller level, which is called the triforium. And then above that again, you get the clerestory. In most of these Gothic cathedrals, you've described it already, you get sort of three levels, like a layer cake of three levels of arches. The bigger one at the arcade, triforium, clerestory. And the reason Wells, I think, is so beautifully proportionate is that the clerestory, the top level, is actually quite large. It sort of almost matches the arcade at the bottom. So generally, you tend to get huge arcade, smaller ones at the top. At Wells, it's slightly different. And so you get so much light in, and it's quite wide. So you get a beautiful amount of light in. The carving, the architecture is absolutely beautiful. The other reason I want to mention Wells, and I'll just end the story here, is that the Wells has this most extraordinary feature. You can't miss it when you go in. We would have seen it. Those so-called scissor arches. Do you remember those in the middle?
Very complex, yes.
They're called scissor arches because it looks like a sort of pair of curved scissors which go...
It's like a figure eight, isn't it, or something, yeah.
Yeah, right in the middle of the nave, holding up the transept. And the reason they're there is that in the early 1300s, poor old Wells started to collapse. And the interesting thing about English interpretation of Gothic architecture is that we embraced it, but we weren't quite as good as the French at doing it. And we didn't get our sums quite right. So when Wells started to fall down, they turned to a local mason, we even know he was called William Joy, and he had this extraordinary idea of putting in these strainer arches. And we'll put a picture on the YouTube channel for people to see, but you can Google it. They're beautiful, but they're quite alien, and they just held the tower and everything together.
Held the roof up, yeah.
Yeah, it just shows that we tried to do it, and we sort of did it in our own beautiful idiosyncratic ways, sort of for the wrong reasons.
I love how the early ecclesiastical architecture was often changed and influenced by very sort of practical things. You mentioned the flying buttresses at Saint Denis, which are these things that come out the side of the building, almost like the legs of a spider or something, that basically hold the walls in, because without them, the walls would push out because the roof is so heavy and the whole thing would fall over. But these flying buttresses become this amazing feature of Gothic architecture. They become so sort of exciting, a whole new thing added to churches. You get them in Bourges as well. But do you know what I remember best about Wells, apart from your scissor arches? There's a fantastic staircase there, isn't there? Does it go up to the Lady Chapel or something? It's a really dramatic, kind of spooky, wonderful staircase that for some reason I've always thought of as like the best staircase I've ever seen. What is that?
I think it goes up to the chapter house, which is beautiful. And it's absolutely glorious. You will have seen it in any kind of Harry Potter film. It's often used for film locations. We'll put a picture of it online. It's absolutely glorious, I agree.
It's a great staircase. Yeah, there are pictures of me on it somewhere or other. But I'm going to take you away from England, and I don't want this to be an England and France thing, but I'm going to take you away because I wanted to deal a bit more with this kind of glory of the stained glass. So the other day I was in Paris and I wanted to go and see the Notre Dame Cathedral, which, as you know, has been rebuilt. And even though it's nowhere near amongst the sort of tallest or biggest cathedrals in France, it is obviously one of the most spectacular. And there was that terrible fire. And it's rebuilt. And I've been dying to see it ever since. And I've been there 4 times, I think, now, and I can't get in. There's always too big a queue, too many people trying to get there before me, and I just can't get in the I can't get in there. I pull out my press card. I say I'm a friend of Bendy or Grosvenor. I do everything I can think of, and they won't let me in, right? So what I do instead is I pop round the corner in the Ile de Cité, which is this little island in the middle of the Seine where all the French kings used to live. So it used to be like Windsor Castle, a kind of island that is also a royal palace. And there you will find the other great bit of ecclesiastical architecture on the Cité, which is Sainte-Chapelle. So Sainte-Chapelle, which means Holy Chapel, of course, it's beautiful. And you've seen it, of course, Bendy.
A long time ago. Absolutely glorious. Yeah.
Absolutely glorious. So Sainte-Chapelle is the most spectacular piece of stained glass Gothic, I think, in the world. Certainly the most spectacular I've seen.
I agree,
and I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. So it's not a cathedral, it's a chapel, a royal chapel, built originally for Louis IX. And he built it to house his relics. He had a great collection of relics. Key one was supposed to be the crown of thorns. So Jesus' actual crown of thorns that he wore on the cross when he died for us was supposed to belong to Louis IX, and he needed a suitably grand place in which to display it.
And the Holy Sponge was the other one.
And the sponge was there. I mean, you're talking
big
time relics, the Holy Sponge, the crown of thorns. I mean, genuinely powerful stuff, which he'd paid a lot of money to get, of course, because there was a great trade in relics back in the Middle Ages. So anyway, between 1238 and 1248, they build this beautiful chapel for him to house his relics in the Cité, the sort of island owned by the French kings. And it's actually a 2-story place, right? So down the bottom, there's this rather cramped area, which is where the plebs went. So ordinary people who weren't kings and queens, weren't members of the Grosvenor family, they went downstairs and prayed in the sort of lower church. But upstairs, where they kept the relics, you have this stupendous space, which is entirely marked out by the stained glass in there. So when you walk in, I mean, someone described it as, they said it's like walking into a kaleidoscope. And it really is, because through the wonders of French Gothic architecture, which by this time had reached its kind of high spot, they could build incredibly thin columns going up to the sky, incredibly thin ribbed vaults above that, and in between, fill them with these gigantic French stained glass windows full of assorted stories from the Old and the New Testament. And really, when you walk in there, it's like walking into a glass box in which the light is coming in glorious quantities. It's so spectacular. You just wonder, how is this staying up here? You know, how can this possibly be so tall and so full of light with having such big windows? And of course, it was, as usual, Gothic could be very practical, and there's some very tricky things going on here. Apparently, they actually had to use metal chains to hold the building in. Like, you know, I have to wear a belt to pull my stomach in because I'm too fat, right? The Sainte-Chapelle, they had to put metal chains around the glass windows to stop them popping out. And on the roof as well. But you don't see any of that. Because when you walk
instead of
in...
buttresses, because buttresses would stop some of the light coming in.
Well, also, there wasn't a lot of room there for the buttresses. Of course, the buttresses would stop the light. But also, it was a very cramped space. You know, the Cité had lots of palaces, other buildings. So it wasn't a place you could expand into another massive cathedral. So it was tight. But it was a brilliant solution, actually, these metal belts that went round. But you don't see them. When you walk in, you have no sense of that at all. You just have this glorious sense of walking into a kaleidoscope. Now, most of the stained glass there is 14th century, well, 13th and 14th century. So, absolutely high Gothic, brilliant telling of the tales of Jesus' story and the Old Testament. But the rose window, and this is the great thing about Gothic cathedrals, is that in the entrance way, the West End, where you come in normally, you'd have this tradition building up of the giant rose window. So these big round windows full of extraordinary things that often appear above the entrance portico of a Gothic cathedral. And in fact, the rose window at Sainte-Chapelle was a little bit later, so it's more 15th century than 14th. But it's absolutely stunningly interesting. So I went in there once with a set of binoculars, Bendy, and I really advise people to do this, right? Because a rose window is made up of hundreds and hundreds of bits. And it looks like like I said, like a giant kind of circle of multicoloured light coming in a big way above the door. But when you look carefully, there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of little bits. And each scene is absolutely brilliant because it describes, in fact, this is the whole rose window is devoted to St. John's Revelation. So that's that great book in the Bible that goes on about the end of the world. So the Last Judgment, all the other stories in it. And if you look carefully with your binoculars at this fantastic rose window, tear yourselves away from the big, big, big clerestory windows that are there and look at the rose window, you've got it all. So you've got the horseman of the apocalypse, you've got the end of the world, you've got Jesus opening the 7 seals, you've got all that spooky stuff that you still see cults in America going on about today, all being described in these brilliant stained glass windows. So it's a thoroughly engrossing, as well as incredibly moving experience. I loved Sainte-Chapelle.
It's absolutely perfect. In fact, we have come to call it rayonnant, the rayonnant style, which is, as you know, the French word rayon meaning ray of light, basically. I am devastated to hear, well, that you haven't got into Notre Dame. And just looking at the stats, producer Tate sent me these stats. We do, in fact, I see, have a listener that is located in the Élysée Palace. So we say to President Macron, I'm so sorry we were rude about your grand new entrance for the Louvre. We would like you to arrange VIP access for Wild and me to come and see your wonderful new restoration.
What a great President Macron is. I mean, absolutely, probably the best since Pompidou. I think, yes, please, President Macron and your gorgeous wife, get us in there, get me and Bendy in there.
I want to end, actually, our Gothic investigations, Wild, with Westminster Abbey. And Westminster Abbey, I think, emerges very directly from Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and I'll tell you why. Westminster Abbey we know and love today, right? Probably the finest bit of Gothic engineering and architecture in Britain. It was started in 1245 by Henry III, King Henry III. And before that, Westminster Abbey had been a Romanesque building built by Edward the Confessor, who was the king before the Norman Conquest. And Edward the Confessor becomes a saint, so he gets buried in there in his own abbey. And Henry III comes along. Now, Henry III, we've discussed him on the podcast before, actually. He's our first great art-mad king. He's also very competitive. And it turns out that Louis IX, who built Sainte-Chapelle, was his brother-in-law and had started building this amazing example of Gothic architecture, holy light coming in Paris. And Henry III decides that he needs to have a bit of that. And he needs to better it. And in fact, there's a French poem which was ascribed to words that Henry III said at the time, and I'll read it out to you. And it's describing Sainte-Chapelle. It says, "By the 5 wounds of God, this same Paris is great. There's a chapel I covet and must alienate." So that is, he must beat it. So he decided in 1245 to rebuild Westminster Abbey. And the other reason he wants to do it is because he needs to have a royal saint. Appropriate setting for a royal saint. That's Edward the Confessor. Because at this time, we're not long after the murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. And Thomas Becket's shrine was luring loads and loads of pilgrims from all over Europe down to Canterbury. And Henry III thought this was a little bit unsettling, and he wanted to have a royal saint in a beautiful new Gothic royal building in London, which could compete not only with Canterbury, but also Paris. So he sets about building this amazing thing. And, well, he spends around about £40,000 on this, which is the equivalent today of many, many hundreds of millions of pounds. And one of the reasons, I don't know if you've ever noticed, Wild, when you go into Westminster Abbey, do you ever notice that it feels quite French?
Not really, but then, quite to be brutally honest with you, my main memory of Westminster Abbey is that it always feels quite dark. It seems like quite a dark place, nothing like Sainte-Chapelle in mood. So maybe I missed some of the details, the French details that I should have seen.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting that Westminster Abbey today has been so transformed into our kind of much more secular sort of national pantheon. You know, the windows are in fact increasingly blocked up by sculptures and memorials to the great and the good. So it's sort of lost any of that kind of original Gothic sense, that sense of holy light. But it's French in the sense that it's quite narrow and very tall. In fact, I think it's still the tallest church in Britain. So Henry III, who of course basically for all intents and purposes thought of himself culturally as quite French. He spoke French, he had a French wife. Louis XI, as I said, was his brother-in-law. He gets a French architect, Henry de Reims, over from France specifically to have some opus Franciscanum, some French-style Gothic architecture to compete with Sainte-Chapelle. And so that's why when you go into Westminster Abbey today, it's very tall, very narrow. It has English qualities, of course, in things like the columns are made of Purbeck marble. And it's all designed around behind the high altar, although it's not so prominently adored today, but the extraordinary tomb of Edward the Confessor. So, well, obviously, when they get round to building art historians and art critics' corner near Poets' Corner, you and I will be in Westminster Abbey, adding to the national pantheon, sorry. But I think Westminster Abbey is a great place to end our Gothic story because, well, I'm going to take you to the Lady Chapel at the end, what we've now come to call the Henry VII's Chapel. Obviously, you've been there. Have you been there recently?
Oh dear. Hand on heart, no. I can't remember the last time I went to the Lady Chapel. I'm sorry. Tell me I'm wrong to do that and tell me why I should go there.
Okay, so the Lady Chapel, built by Henry VII, this is the extraordinary kind of end tacked on to Westminster Abbey, started in the early 1500s. And it's beautiful chiefly because of this extraordinary vaulted ceiling, which is so wonderfully carved, very thin, almost pierced stone. It seems like it can hardly be hanging in any way. It's just sort of floating above us. And the Henry VII Chapel, that is where his tomb is. And I think that's probably the kind of the final high point of English Gothic architecture. And while if you had been recently, you would have known that Henry VII's tomb is surrounded by what we call a kind of chantry railing, a chantry gate, which is this extraordinary piece of Gothic metalwork full of little pointed arches, bronze, gilt bronze, and we know it was made by a guy called Thomas the Dutchman, incidentally. But if you look through those little Gothic pointed arches, you will see that Henry VII's actual tomb, the bit where his sculpture is, his tomb sculpture alongside his wife Elizabeth of York, made by an Italian artist called Torrigiano Wild.
Oh, yes. I know Torrigiano. He's the guy that broke Michelangelo's nose.
That's right.
The tomb of Henry VII, of course. Yes, I've seen it. Not recently, but I've seen it.
Okay, well, you will know, Wild, that it is decorated not with Gothic pointed arches, but with classical columns. So this is, you can literally look through and see the end of the Gothic story in England and the beginning of the Renaissance one. So that, I think, is a moment for us to end the story on.
That's right, because Torrigiano was in Florence. That's when he broke Michelangelo's nose. So he would have brought the very latest developments in Italian Renaissance art to England. How fascinating. I must go back there and look at it again. Oh, dear, I should have done that a long time ago. Bendy, you've led us on a beautiful trail here through this marvellous period of the Gothic. We must do this again. And of course, I mean, our international listeners, see, the thing is, it's not just a question of going to France or going to England, to London, to see Gothic. You know, I've seen great Gothic art in Spain, great cathedral in Barcelona, Germany, of course, Cologne Cathedral, Italy, Milan, Poland, for heaven's sake, the great Cathedral of St. Mary in Krakow. There's great Gothic art everywhere. People should go in and look at it because, it's good for the spirit, it's good for the soul, it's always uplifting. What I do wish, Bendy, is I could take you with me, stick you in my pocket, so that every time I go into a great Gothic cathedral, you can tell me a lot more about the history of it and what I should be looking for, because you're a wonderful guide to these things.
Oh, good fun talking to you about it. Well, and at some point we'll have to do the Gothic revival, of course.
The Gothic revival, indeed.
Yeah, that's another story.
Well, not now, though, because we've run out of time, Bendy. As always, outlived our welcome here and talked ourselves to death. But yes, Gothic cathedrals, international visitors, anybody still wanting to see any of the things we've been talking about, please go to the ZCZ channel on YouTube, where you can see this glorious podcast in full colour with all the pictures added to it if you want to do more than listen to it. And on that lovely festive note, Christmas special coming up soon from us, on that festive note, it's goodbye from me.
Oh, and also, just on the matter of the Christmas special, well, we thought we would do a question time. So you mentioned the YouTube channel there. People can, if they have a question for us, you can leave that in the comments on YouTube, or you can send us a message on Twitter or Blue Sky or Instagram or any of those things. We'd love to hear your questions, and we'll answer them in the Christmas special. And until then, see you next week.
Waldy and Bendy.